All right, welcome back, everyone. I hope you enjoyed lunch. Those were some amazing remarks from our guests, the Nobel Prize laureates. Hard act to follow, Swati and panel, but I know you guys are up for it. So let me introduce the moderator of our upcoming panel. Swati Mehta is the program director at Justice for All for Pathfinders for Peaceful, Just, and Inclusive Societies Initiative, which I have to say, for those of you who don't know it, it's one of the premier institutions promoting people-centered justice at this time in the world. Swati started her career providing legal aid for women. She soon moved on to systemic reform. More recently, her work has focused on legal empowerment, as well as decentralization and decentralization of justice, hence moving it towards the people. Swati is a Chevening scholar and holds an LLM in international criminal law and criminology and criminal justice from King's College London. And last but not least, she's been a great colleague to us at the ABA and many others in this room. Without further ado, I'll turn it over to Swati. It's all yours, Swati.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you again, you and the ABU colleagues for organizing this discussion. I see this is post-lunch. So yes, a hard act to follow after the amazing speakers. Just wanted to let you know that we have another panelist who's been delayed, but will join us very soon in the next couple of minutes, I think. It's been such an interesting day with so much food for thought and a great discussion on people-centered justice. So why are we talking about people-centered justice? And I heard this question, I think, in different forms through the day. What happened to plain old justice, the rule of law, or access to justice? Is this another fad? Is it just old wine in a new bottle? Or is it something more? And I think we heard some reflections in the previous panel. Let me also try and take a step back and kind of provide some context for this conversation. So it's not that people-centered justice was kind of invented in 2019 when the Hague Declaration came out, or when the task force report on people-centered justice called the Justice for All came out. But the reason it was articulated in those terms is rooted in the Sustainable Development Goals, which were adopted in 2015. SDG 16.3 focuses on rule of law and equal access to justice for all. It does not say access to justice, it says equal access to justice. And it says equal access to justice for all. And yet data shows that about 5.1 billion, and we've heard Betsy give us some very depressing data. So data shows 5.1 billion people in the world, which is about 3/4 of the world's population, lacks meaningful access to justice. And this was before the pandemic. Since then, we've witnessed multiple coups, shrinking civic space, and a war. There are now, we talk in terms of, in UN speak, we talk about polycrises that are facing us. There is the food crisis, there is the climate crisis, there's energy crisis, there is the debt crisis. All of these have seen increased income and social inequalities across the world. And all of this has kind of weakened the trust, not only between governments and people, between institutions and people, but also at the multilateral level between governments themselves. It's clear that something needs to change. And it is in this context that people-centered justice kind of helps make some sense of this and helps us take some kind of proactive, preventive measures to rebuild trust and strengthen the social contract. Ultimately, the question boils down to this: can our systems deliver for people? And I'm recalling recently when I was last in DC, this was in March, and there was the Summit for Democracy, the zero-day event. And I heard someone from Liberia say that, we transformed the whole system, and I was in the Ministry of Justice, and we were talking independence, judiciary, and I go to the community, and I'm talking about this and showing them slides. And then someone raises his hand and says, can I feed that to my children? Can I roll up all your good words, and can I feed that to my children? So all these ideals about democracy, rule of law, independence of judiciary, if they do not deliver for people, they will not have meaning. People will not connect with them. How do we make them deliver for people is the question that all of us, not just justice systems, all of us have to think about. Do we focus on outcomes for people is the question before us. Of course, justice is not and cannot be a panacea for all ills, but it is an important tool in our toolkit to prevent and resolve people's problems and rebuild their trust in institutions and strengthen the social contract. And this is where people-centered justice comes in. We've heard from our opening speakers on what this is, and I don't want to go more into it, but a few points perhaps that I would like to reiterate and re-emphasize. Access to justice is not only about access to courts. It must be about people's ability to prevent and resolve their problems, which also includes access to courts. People-centered justice is about a systems approach. I think Sam mentioned, and I forget your words, Sam, but you say it much more beautifully than I will. It's not about this projectized approach where we help a few people. Yes, that's important, but can we scale it up? Is it sustainable? Does it impact the system? That is what is important. And if you want to ensure this and move from the system of justice, which serves a few, to a system that serves all, then we need to rethink how we transform systems by putting people at their center. And last thing I want to highlight is people-centered justice is not, repeat not, anti-judges, anti-lawyers, anti-institutions. It is an approach that can and must apply to both institutions as well as to bottom-up approaches. How do you design your courts? I mean, in the morning we heard the previous panel talking about where do you situate public defenders' offices? What do your courtrooms look like? Can people walk in and understand the system? How do our institutions existing for lawyers and judges, or do they exist for people? That's what we need to think about, and that's how our policies need to be driven. But I shall stop now. We have a great panel today. Thank you for joining us. And we will today now discuss how some of your work speaks to this. How do we bring about systemic change? How do we ensure service delivery, which is people-centered and has impact on people's lives? Very quickly, let me introduce the panel. We have Timothy Meyer. I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. Tim is a senior program manager in ABA ROLI and currently supports ABA's program in Benin, Burkina Faso, and Niger. And he previously led ABA ROLI programming in Somalia as part of expanding access to justice program. He's worked on pretrial detention, looking at informal justice systems, as well as working with paralegals in those contexts. We also have Adonia Simpson. Adonia is the Director of Policy and Pro Bono at the ABA Commission on Immigration. Ms. Simpson has substantial experience in both private practice and legal services, focusing primarily on immigration issues, and her on-ground experience provides invaluable insights on policy issues and pro bono engagements. Last but not least, we will also later have Paulette, who I can introduce when she joins us. We have Mac Vector, who's a Deputy Public Defender with the San Diego Office of the Public Defender. As a member of the Public Defender Homeless Court Team and Steering Committee, Matt represents San Diego's homeless population during monthly homeless court sessions and orchestrates and executes the annual homeless court at Stand Down, which is San Diego's annual 3-day homeless veteran event. You can find more information on the panelists and the speaker bios on the website. And I will now stop here. Very welcome, really happy to have you, all of you, as part of the panel. And without much further ado, if you're all willing, can we just jump into some questions initially? All right, you all work with and implement different programs in different contexts, some within US, some have worked outside of the US. Could you provide us a flavor of what you do and how this is people-centered? Tim, you can go first.
Sure, great, thank you. Yeah. Oh, thank you. Thank you, Swati, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm very excited to be able to speak a bit about ABA ROLI's program in Somalia, which we refer to as the Expanding Access to Justice Program. This is a USAID-supported program that ABA ROLI implements in collaboration with the organization PACT and in consortium with Freedom House, as well as in partnership with a variety of Somali government entities and civil society organizations. The Expanding Access to Justice program, or EAJ as we refer to it, has multiple components that support justice service delivery, and the primary component that is people-centered concerns a service delivery model that adapts the community paralegal model to the Somalia context. And we describe the service delivery model as justice promoters. So I'll be speaking about justice promoters today. A bit of background, the idea of community-based paralegals, such as our justice promoters, they're not like traditional paralegals that would support a lawyer. Instead, they're individuals of good standing in their community who are selected to serve their community, who are trained in basic law, and who are provided skills like mediation, public education, advocacy, and organizing. So the EAJ program introduced justice promoters both in the north in Somaliland as well as in the southwest of Somalia, in the regions in and around Mogadishu. At the start of the program, in an approach consistent with the people-centered justice principles that motivates us to put people first and to put their justice needs at the center of the justice delivery model, ABA ROLI undertook a variety of research initiatives. And this was all intended to better understand what kind of justice people were looking for and what kind of what services they ultimately need. So the types of research that we undertook included access to justice assessments that were based on household surveys, as well as key informant interviews. We conducted a gender and social inclusion study and analysis, and various issue-specific and geographically specific studies to understand specifics about justice needs on topics such as land rights adjudication in Mogadishu, or the use of Sharia in dispute resolution. So we ultimately didn't need this research to tell us that Somalia is a complex justice environment. We knew that in Somalia, norms, institutional structures, economic forces, and security considerations all come together in a complex and dynamic way to influence how any kind of justice problem is resolved. But nonetheless, the research did inform us a great deal more about Somalia's plural justice environment. And the plural justice environment I'm referring to here is a kind of context that exists in a lot of locations globally. And in Somalia, it's characterized by three primary forums. The first forum is the customary dispute resolution path that is led by clan elders who apply a customary precedent that's referred to as hair. The second forum is religious leaders who might apply an interpretation of Sharia in resolving disputes, and the third is state justice institutions. Our research identified that within this plural justice context, there's many challenges, and I'll note just three primary challenges that emerged. The first was a general lack of confidence in those state justice institutions. When an individual encountered a justice problem, they were never certain what sort of norm or law might be applied in the resolution of that problem. A second significant challenge that existed in that context was the existence of different and competing notions of justice. So the customary system in applying hair is often intended to emphasize community harmony, and often that comes at the expense of individual rights. And by community harmony, what we really mean is the harmony among the male leadership of a clan. And then the third notable challenge was that entire populations were excluded from the decision-making bodies in any of these forums. And so that meant that marginalized groups, including minority clans, internally displaced peoples, women, as well as anyone with disabilities might be negatively affected when approaching one of these forums. So these are big challenges, and they were not easily addressed. Nonetheless, the Justice Promoter Service Delivery model sought to serve as a vehicle to improve justice journeys and to better empower individuals to access services and opportunities. So through the justice promoters, services were made more accessible. They were brought closer to communities and closer to individuals who needed them. The justice promoters also focused on education and empowering people so that individuals were involved in determining and deciding their own justice pathway. And the justice promoters were also able to provide a certain level of contextual awareness with the political dynamics as well as specific cultural circumstances really impacting on the resolution of a dispute. It was very important that they have that very grassroots knowledge of community dynamics. So the Expanding Access to Justice program was able to realize this approach in partnership with a number of Somali organizations that already enjoyed the confidence and trust of some of the communities that they served. So some of the partners that we worked with were traditional legal assistance organizations, including the Somaliland Women Lawyers Association. And some of our partners were organizations that serve distinct client groups, such as minority clans or women, or were focused on education or individuals living with disabilities. So together with our partners, the EAJ program was able to train more than 140 justice promoters nationally. And these justice promoters working in their communities were able to receive and address a variety of justice issues, including resolving matters such as divorce, inheritance disputes, familial maintenance, as well as SGBV issues, land disputes, and also cases of abuse of authority that were directed towards minority groups. Last year alone, the program was able to direct more than 800 cases to the Expanding Access to Justice program partners through the justice promoters, and notably more than 80% of those cases came from women who had approached the justice promoters. So with that, I'll take a stop, but that's the basic overview of our approach in expanding access to justice in Somalia.
Thanks, Tim. That was really comprehensive, and I immediately have lots of questions, but I shall wait. But maybe if, Adonia, you wanted to go.
Sure, and before I talk about some of the models and processes we've been developing with the Commission on Immigration, I thought it might be helpful to give a little bit of background about the immigration system and process and kind of what we're confronted with when we're trying to provide education and information and access to justice for the community. The immigration system is civil here in the United States, which means that yes, you can have an attorney, but one won't be appointed to you. Right now, there's about 1.8 million cases pending in the removal system. Those are defensive cases, people that are actively in deportation proceedings, the majority of whom, about half, a little over half, are unrepresented. About, I want to say 750,000 individuals in that number are seeking a protection-based type of relief, so asylum. And these are just the defensive cases. We also have applicants who are affirmatively seeking asylum, who've come here through other means, who are not actively in removal proceedings and are seeking protection. So the numbers are huge. And I think earlier I heard two panelists say that I think one of the biggest issues with people-centered justice is often the laws are not people-centered. If anyone's had any exposure to the immigration system and immigration laws here in the United States, they can be incredibly complex. So a big part of the systems and the models that we're proposing and developing are ways to make those laws more accessible so that people are empowered to be a part of their cases. Something else I heard earlier that I think really resonated with me and really was part of the reason we were looking at creative models that uses non-lawyers, that uses technology, that uses to engage and empower people outside of the traditional ways that we have been doing it here when it comes to immigration work, was the fact that, let's be honest, getting an attorney for everyone is impossible. These numbers, finding people with expertise even recent in the last couple of years where we've seen this huge outpour of pro bono attorneys wanting to provide support to Ukrainians or Afghans, the numbers of people who are left unrepresented are staggering. And so it's either, think creatively about empowering people to proceed in their cases or nothing. So that's where we started, which I thought would be helpful. And then when we started having these meetings around people-centered justice, a light bulb went off for me. I realized that the ABA Commission on Immigration, we've actually been doing this for about 2 decades, and I didn't even realize that's kind of what the goal of it was. Since 1998, our program in our project in Harlingen, Texas, had actually been providing legal orientation. In the years that followed that, the Department of Justice actually picked it up, and this became a model that's been executed and implemented throughout the country. Individuals who are detained are able to access a legal orientation, oftentimes and usually, frankly, without an attorney. These are trained individuals. Some of our interns who work on our national immigration detention hotline are actually here today, and these are people that are providing much needed information to orient people about the process, their rights, and relief available to them and how to access it. So that's, I wanted to set a little bit better background. Sorry, before I jump in, I'll keep it very brief because I know we have a lot to discuss and a lot of great questions. But some of the concepts that we learned through this legal orientation program, this ability to deliver services through non-attorneys, using technology, trying to orient the community, these concepts and best practices have really informed our work, which we're testing and piloting right now in the Afghan space. As you may know, we had about 80,000 Afghan newcomers come in the last couple of years. About 60% of them are not eligible for special immigrant visas, so they're going to be seeking protection-based relief. And once again, we're in this situation where there's not enough attorneys. So the models that we've been testing it's through a partnership, and I think that's what's really important is working with organizations with expertise in approaching challenges in different ways. So the Welcome Legal Alliance incorporates partners that have specialties in like training attorneys and non-attorneys. Organization that would be Vicina. We're working with Immigrant Justice Campaign on recruiting volunteers, both attorney and non-attorney volunteers. The Welcome.us, who's engaging corporate partners to support these efforts and, like, let's be honest, fund these efforts. As amazing as pilots can be, you do need the resources and staffing to invest in them. And then, one of the models that we've developed is what we call a module series, where we provide these concepts of legal orientation and we engage non-attorneys, we use Zoom, and we can explore all the mechanics of this later. But over time, over the course of 8 weeks, applicants are able to essentially by themselves with the support of a non-attorney, with access to one attorney, so about one attorney for every 10 to 20 people, able to build a pretty amazing asylum case and file it on their own and be prepared. So we're taking this, that's just a high-level overview of the model, but we're looking to apply it to other contexts, to the removal defense space. How can this apply to individuals who are not going to be able to access attorneys in the defensive posture? And just really focusing, going back to people-centered, acknowledging that our communities are able to access technology, and that also we can work harder on making information accessible and empowering people to navigate this system and this process on their own.
Thank you. You said all the right things about lawyers not having enough lawyers at any point to serve everyone on every problem that they have, and how do we think then innovatively perhaps use technology and other ways to help people prevent and resolve their problems. You touched upon how important it is to empower people and partner with others in this. Matt, if you would also like to come in now and perhaps tell us a little bit about what.
Sure, and I am a member advisor to the Commission on Homelessness and Poverty. I'm not an ABA employee, although I feel like I work for the ABA but not really get paid. But I'm a public defender down in San Diego. I've been a public defender for probably over 14 years, which is crazy to keep saying every time I have one of these. But I have been running the homeless court program since 2018, and it really is where homeless courts started nationally. And it is one of the Commission on Homelessness and Poverty's national initiatives, is replication and technical assistance for homeless courts in lots of jurisdictions. What homeless court is we talk about collaborative courts, we talk about specialty courts. The way that I like to describe homeless court is a recognition court. It is using the providers that are in the community, community-based providers, whether it be substance abuse, whether it be mental health, whether it be housing, whether it be veterans assistance, whatever it may be. If the person is engaging with one of those community-based organizations and working on themselves, not doing community service, but doing community service on themselves and addressing that root cause, then that community-based provider can refer to us once they've met certain goals, and we will clear all of their infraction, parking, low-level misdemeanor, and in some jurisdictions, low-level felony cases, so that, think of it this way, they're on that positive trajectory that they've been working on themselves. It doesn't do a whole lot of good for them to get out of that with $3,000 worth of traffic debt, right? Where it's negatively impacting their collections, whether it's impacting that they have an outstanding warrant, even if they've had a felony case that's been in a reentry court, like Judge said earlier, or whatever it may be. They might have a minor misdemeanor or an infraction warrant that's making it so they can't get their benefits, right? This is making it so we're just getting out of their way. We're recognizing their work and getting out of their way. And similar to kind of the person-centered justice or people-centered justice, when I was listening to all the things this morning and thinking about this presentation, I keep coming back to the idea of PCJ as customer service, right? I often describe as a public defender, talking, I love listening to Malia talk, right? It's about them, right? For the prosecutors, it's about the victims, and I get it, but really, at the end of the day, the court has the jurisdiction over the client or the defendant, right? And for us, it's about customer service. What do they need, right? That was one of the questions earlier. What is your problem, right? So yes, they might have a theft case, right? But it's not because they like stealing things. It's probably because there's a drug issue, or they might have a systemic issue where they need food, or a housing issue, whatever it may be. So as long as they're addressing that root cause, then we as the court just want to get out of their way. And it's not just limited to the criminal traffic fines and fees and parking. We've now expanded it to where at every homeless court session that is monthly, we have the Department of Child Support there, we have legal aid there, we have the DMV there, we have the clerk assessor recorder that helps them get birth certificates, we have the League of Women Voters and the Registrar of Voters getting people registered to vote. We're trying to make it a one-stop shop so that if you're working on yourself, we'll be there to meet you, right? What I always tell you, take a step, we'll take a step. And we've been doing it in San Diego for over 20 years now with the assistance of the ABA as the initiative. And more recently, in a post-pandemic, post-pandemic, put that in air quotes, we have really tried to even go closer to in the community and meet them where they are. So we've been doing these homeless court pop-up events where it's not just the monthly where we go and meet people that have already addressed their issues in these community-based programs, but we bring that same mentality of everything in one place, and we go to the community center. We go to the library. We've partnered with our County Office of Homeless Solutions to identify those places where people are just walking by, and if they walk up and if they engage with any of those community homeless court providers that we have there, then we will get rid of those immediate barriers. So if they have a misdemeanor warrant, we'll recall that warrant. If it's an old one, we'll probably dismiss it. If it's not that old, we need to address it or the restitution, then we'll set it for a future court date and have that warm handoff. We have the Registrar of Voters. We have all those people that I just talked about at that event, so we can eliminate those immediate barriers, and we can say, you know what? You took a step, we're gonna take a step with you, and if you need to continue clearing up those fines and fees, we're gonna partner you with one of these community-based organizations, and then we're gonna clear everything. So the whole idea is really meeting them where they're at, asking them what their problem is, and trying to meet that with, at this point, we've been doing it for a long time, but we have over 96 approved providers in the County of San Diego. And that's everything from the providers I mentioned all the way to county agencies that can refer as well, like drug court or things like that. So we do it all over the country. We just had a pop-up in Charleston. We're working with Portland. We just got a thing with St. Augustine, Florida. So if anybody that's listening wants to talk about having one of these in their community, come and talk to me.
Thanks, Matt. And right on time, we have Paulette joining us. So Paulette Brown is the first woman of color to lead the American Bar Association as its president in its history. Her presidential and initiatives through her diversity and inclusion 360 Commission resulted, I hear, in 7 major policies developed and approved by ABA and have had a long-lasting impact on diversity and legal inclusion in legal profession and justice system. Ms. Brown simultaneously served as the first person of color to chair the Labor and Employment section of the New Jersey State Bar Association, and she's also a past president of the National Bar Association. She's a partner and chief diversity and inclusion officer at Lord
No
LLP.
more,
No more.
retired allegedly.
Or so she claims. So welcome, Paulette. We were just discussing some of the programs and just getting a flavor of things. And Matt here just spoke about the homeless courts, how they take a cross-sectoral approach, a multi-sectoral approach. I was wondering if any of you, and you all have touched upon how you've used data. Tim spoke about how you started by collecting data, but I was wondering and I know, Adonia, that your program, the one that you mentioned, is new and you're in a phase of data collection, but I was wondering if, so when we talk about data, it's about how we design programs, but also as we move along, are we moving in the right direction? How do we know that? Are we actually helping people resolve problems? I was wondering if any of you wanted to reflect a little bit on the use of data or in terms of systemic shift and transformation, so that it's not this projectized approach. Again, Sam, looking to you, but so as we design these projects and try to kind of think about what beyond this, how do we make this sustainable? How does system meet us? So we have these great programs, but can they become something? Is there scope that we see for them becoming more national, and are there efforts towards that? Whether when you were working within Somalia or when you were starting your program on using technology and other kinds of support that you provide to people, or through your homeless programs. I don't know if any of you wanted to reflect on any of these aspects.
I can jump in first. Right now, what's interesting when it comes to immigration data, people aren't familiar with Syracuse track data, they do FOIA, Freedom of Information Act requests to EOIR and USCIS, and they gather a lot of information. You get the numbers of people that are represented, unrepresented, successful on their cases, not successful in their cases, countries of origin. But what that data doesn't tell you is, first of all, the space that we're starting to occupy, which is more pro se assistance, right? What sort of impact and efficacy and change can, really heavy pro se assistance give, right? We know the numbers of represented versus unrepresented, but where does pro se assistance change it? And that's the data that we're hoping to start collecting, because that doesn't exist. I'm hopeful maybe there's some ways, because EOIR and USCIS do gather, the Executive Office for Immigration Review and USCIS, U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Service, immigration attorney, acronyms all over the place. There are ways that they could collect, general information about people that have been assisted pro se, where an entry of an appearance of an attorney was not provided. So I think there's some space to use Freedom of Information Act requests to get some very general data. Will take time to show any difference, but on the level of the project that we're implementing, it's very much, it's going to also take time, because these cases, despite hopes that these cases would be adjudicated quickly, we are seeing increased timelines. So this could take years. So that, we can, we do immediate exit surveys asking people about their experience, if they felt that they, received the assistance that they were looking for, ask some questions about better understanding the system. But, the actual outcomes are gonna take time to track. But I think that's going to be very, very important, particularly in trying to keep momentum up around assisted pro se models, which are going to be increasingly important.
I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to say, and I apologize to everybody for my tardiness. It's a long story. Again, I apologize, but my perspective is kind of different. And my experiences are not sort of at the level of everyone else at the table. And my experiences have been not so much in a formalized way. Data has obviously been used to implement the types of programs for which I am familiar, but it's not the structured kind of data that is kept on immigration, for example. And so it's generally sort of isolated to particular areas and not sort of a universal kind of system where you're looking at immigration, but more of we're looking at this specific issue. For example, in the Philippines, we're looking at how we're going to serve indigenous people a couple of times a year. Or if you look to the United States, you look at how we're going to service these juveniles in the Red Hook section of Brooklyn. Or you're going to look at a particular legal services program and determine how innovation can help to get, sort of mobilize people and get them the kind of services that they need. So it's not the kind of data-driven sort of situation that you're talking about and that you actually asked the question for, but it is, when you think about people-centered justice, it is encompassing just more than one thing, more than what we traditionally think about as justice, going to court, et cetera. It's what Justice Breyer talked about when he went to India and he saw all the ladies in line, and there were 3 different sets of people, sort of unrelated, it seemed, but, putting all of those pieces together to provide the type of justice that people actually really need. Yeah.
And I would say I think what's said best earlier is that data is how you get the resources for this kind of justice, right? PCJ.
Right.
I can tell you I'm a data nerd. I try to keep as much data on my program as I can. So, since April of 2018, over 15,000 cases have been either dismissed or had the fines and fees satisfied. Probably over $6 million in barriers that have been lifted from people's shoulders. Numbers of warrants, I think, is over several hundred warrants have been recalled. These are each individual one of those things is something that's going to keep somebody from getting their apartment, right? It's going to keep somebody continuing that cycle of having to go steal for food or having to go ride the trolley or light rail without a fare, right? So by providing that positive impact of saying the court is going to meet you where you're at and lift that barrier, even if they do pick up another ticket at some point in their life, right? They're more likely to address it. They're more likely to come to court instead of be afraid of it. So using what you can to create a positive interaction is going to make it so down the line, that next person, that family, that community, as the judge was saying earlier, it impacts everybody.
Sounds good. I don't know, Tim, if you want to come or should we?
Yeah, here we go. I can just add really quick to that. Within our programming in Somalia and the Expanding Access to Justice program, we placed a heavy emphasis on data collection with our partners, working with them to design tools to receive clients and maintain a database that would help them understand who their clients are and what their needs are. This is very useful in a context where there's a lot of unknowns because it can shed a light on places where there may be opportunities. So for one just quick example, we also worked, in addition to working with justice promoters, worked with courts, and one of the courts that we worked with in Mogadishu, we were able to work with them to look at their documentation of the cases they'd received. And all of the cases that were referred to them from the community that were documented concerned a specific kind of case that related to familial discipline. And that was both an indication that there was at least some basis on which there was trust of that court to provide some service that we could look to follow up on and understand in greater detail how do we build on this trust. But it also was very elucidating of what is the relationship between this court and this community. And it was reduced down to that one narrow value add. And if there hadn't been that maintenance of, even in the rudimentary ways that it was, if there hadn't been that maintenance of case information, nobody in the court had told us that. They hadn't perhaps realized that. But after evaluating that, we were able to follow up on that and try to build on that.
No, absolutely. I just remember when I was in Myanmar before I came to New York, and I remember people after people after people would go and try to register their land, and they wouldn't be able to register jointly in the name of the husband and the wife. There was nothing in law which was preventing this. And I kept on asking, and at least in main part of Myanmar, the traditional law is very fair in terms of allowing women property. And I was like, why can't you register this land? And it took so much. After collecting a lot of data, we saw it was just one form. The form basically said name of the household head. If someone just changed that form and simply say names of people who want to register, people could register. It wasn't that the law prohibited. It's just that you need that kind of data to understand how do you use law to prevent some of the injustices from occurring. But maybe moving on, Adonia, you mentioned a lot about how you've been using technology to reach some of the remote communities. And I don't know if you want to expand a little bit on this, because in terms of technology, and we saw with COVID also how we all have adapted to technology, but one always hears about how limiting it can be for some people, maybe in rural communities, people who may not have access to internet, older people who may not be as adept to kind of adapting to this technology. And I was wondering how you use it, and what are your lessons in terms of using it more responsibly and in a more inclusive manner?
Absolutely. And I think, the pandemic taught us a lot. One thing, the Commission on Immigration had been providing legal orientation and services telephonically by hotline for years. So we'd always been kind of doing some aspect of remote work, where it's sometimes harder to connect with somebody because you're not seeing their face. When the pandemic, when we were in the midst of the pandemic, we'd started a project around temporary protected status. There was huge numbers of Venezuelans, Haitians, and other populations that were in need of services to reapply for a TPS, and we had to quickly shift to an online with partners. And some of the immediate things, the things that you identified were some of the immediate things people said. People are not going to be able to do this. They can't access this. They can't do this. And I thought we were kind of underselling it, underestimating communities. People are resourceful. Oftentimes people, do have family members that have a smartphone. At least in immigrant communities, we are seeing at least one person in the family has a smartphone, if not a tablet. But also another thing was thinking creatively around hybrid ways to access technology. Maybe it's a local library. Maybe it's a local school. Is there a place that somebody can access a computer? And then another thing that we've done is really do education around the technology that we're using, and doing it in ways that just is not just a really densely written one-pager, where it's visual, where there's a video that's walking somebody through actually accessing the Zoom link and going into a breakout room and renaming themselves. And something that we found is a lot of the people that had indicated, our community can't do this, it can't be done, people don't know how to access Zoom. We changed that a lot. We were able to work around that. With that being said, there are some folks that aren't able to access technology, and that's a reality. And that's where we have to think creatively and try to connect those individuals with other resources, other service providers as needed. But I do think we need to embrace, the immigrant community's ability to use technology. It's really been quite amazing to see. And it's a really important response, because when it comes to immigration legal services, we have legal deserts. We have certain areas of the country where we just have lots of attorneys and lots of legal service providers. And then we have little deserts where, people might have to drive 5 or 6 hours, not only to access an attorney, but maybe just to access their closest immigration court or their closest immigration office. So by using technology, we're able to leverage volunteers from across the country and bring them to people that may not otherwise be able to access the legal information and legal assistance. So we've had a really positive experience with it, and I think there was resistance. And I think the pandemic really did push a lot of people to realize that it's doable. And I think the most important lesson that we took away from it was thinking, how can we provide that education in a way that meets, is able to access all, all groups are able to access, and providing the information in different ways. And like not just thinking about how we learn things, but how others may be able to get on board.
Matt, do you want to come on the technology bit?
Just to kind of build on that, I say that, never let a good pandemic go to waste, right? We had to develop a lot of technology to keep the wheels running of the court system, especially on the criminal end, because we couldn't just put it on hold. People were still getting picked up and arrested and incarcerated for crime. But it's not a replacement. We just had a summit, the Indigent Defense Advisory Group, for ABA, just had a thing on technology and the ethics of video conferencing, right? I mean, there are pitfalls for sure. So technology should be used as an addendum, right? I mean, our homeless court, similar to the way the judge said, our judge is standing there in the community, still has the robe on, although I'm going to talk to him about that. But shakes the participant's hand, really makes it a personal, cathartic experience, right? But we use the technology for those pop-ups, right? So we can go into the community, and I have a judge and a clerk over at the courthouse on call, just ready to recall warrants and sign things electronically. And yes, we can sign things electronically, and it's valid, I promise, right? And then they're able to walk right back over electronically to the DMV and get their license 5 seconds later, right? So technology can be used as an addendum to make things better, not as a replacement.
No, absolutely. And I think your experience also bears that. And Paulette, maybe I can call you to come in here now. So technology is one of the ways that we can reach out to remote communities that are not serviced by lawyers or when there is a pandemic. And how do we kind of complement that with use of human resources? And maybe, I don't know if you would like to speak about other ways that we could reach out to other communities. You mentioned Philippines when you joined, and
Right.
if you could speak to how some of your work there in terms of the mobile courts or legal aid services that were provided to remote communities would be very interesting to hear.
Great. So let me just make clear, I'm not like these guys. I don't run any programs. I don't have that kind of expertise. I sort of parachute in on other programs and see how well they do things, and maybe they can be replicated somewhere else. And so the Philippines was really a good example. I was actually in the Philippines for a completely different purpose. I found out, I met with there's a mandatory bar association there, but I met with the bar leaders of the Philippine Bar Association, and then the American Bar Association has programs there, and they were participating with the Philippine Bar Association to provide legal services. They have what they call a legal caravan, where they go out in buses. I confess, I thought it was actually going to be a caravan of like cars and buses going to this location, but no, everybody found their own way there. Just a part of me being naive, but everybody found their own way there, and they had about 500 lawyers to volunteer over the course of the day, and it was to your point about something like Miramar. So the indigenous people are trying to get their deeds and their land rights, et cetera. And so that was the primary focus. And I also have to confess that, I never thought of a concept of indigenous people living in the Philippines. But understanding the people who have migrated there, obviously, yes, there are indigenous people there, but they came to the location, they go to the locations where the people are, which I think is very important. And although it's a mandatory bar, people still volunteer. And what they did is they combined it with medical services. So they went with doctors, which is, I think, a whole part of what you have to do when you think about people-centered justice. What other services do they need in order to function? And so they combined with the doctors who were providing essential services. So one of the services, in addition to and they used a lot of technology, by the way, during this process. So all of the lawyers had computers set up. They had signs so that people knew exactly where to go, which lawyer to go to resolve the particular issue. So it was very structured, very, very much thought out in a very positive way. And then they got the doctors. So they had the lawyers on this side and they had the doctors on this side. And as I mentioned, doctors were providing essential services. One service was vision services that they were providing. And the other service, although it could be considered an essential service, was something that didn't occur to me because it didn't quite fit with the vision thing. Until I was talking and I was looking out at the audience, and I'll bet nobody in here can guess what the other services that the doctors were providing. They were circumcising little boys. And so necessary, obviously, but it was something that was unexpected. I didn't expect to look out and see a kid being circumcised, but that combined kind of services. And I thought to myself, what a great idea this is. Why can't this be replicated in a lot of different places? Combining medical services with legal services, because generally people who need legal services and that type of free legal services, they need free medical attention as well. And so that just really sort of resonated with me and kind of had me thinking about, and I actually came back to some, local bars, because in the US we've got bars in every state. And what can we do with the particular bars in every state to sort of make this sort of thing happen, to have people go out in various, especially rural communities. And, you talk about technology, I remember, and how long it takes some people to get to where they are. But in one community, and that was through my volunteer work with legal services, as the eagle flies, you had a town, and the court was just like maybe 5 miles, 10 miles as the eagle flies, but they couldn't get to it that way because there were these deep valleys and so forth. So they would have to drive maybe a day or so to get to the other side. So they set up like a phone booth sort of situation on each side, where the judge was on one side and the litigant was on the other side. So they were able to engage in, that sort of access to justice without that type of travel involved. And, the other thing with the phones and so forth is that so many people, even if they don't have landlines, they have throwaway phones, they have some kind of cellular phone, and obviously through the pandemic and so forth, a lot of legal services providers found ways to communicate and provide essential information through text messages and SMS messages that people could actually receive without having an expensive phone system to receive the information. So I think that, technology and just being innovative in our thinking and how it is we can reach people. And there also has to be a willingness to do it, because in legal services and so forth, some of those people are paid. All of the people in the Philippines were volunteers. And so how do we get more people to volunteer in that way to provide these essential services?
Thank you. One more thing maybe I can ask you, and we heard the previous panel, Paulette also talked about the invisible women and how the systems are often, perhaps designed by men for men. And this is equally true for other groups who are most at risk of being left behind.
Right.
Maybe for you to reflect on your work relating to inclusion and diversity, and talking a little bit about why you think ensuring diversity and inclusion in bar and judiciary and other justice actors can help people-centered justice, or is very much a part of being people-centered.
Okay, so when you talk about data, there's a lot of data that shows people who are not just traditionally excluded, but people who are over-included in some aspects of the judiciary. And so, to me, one of the best things that people can do to sort of avoid this is to educate people on a regular basis. Educate people to look at data, when they believe that they are doing what is right and what is fair, to look at the data so that to determine how you have treated other people who have to interface with the justice system, and how you're treating this current person who may not necessarily look like you. And I'll give you an example. I was sort of giving some education to some prosecutors, and I was talking about how juveniles in certain counties were tried as adults, and that they were predominantly, they were in counties that were predominantly or had a high percentage of Black and brown people. And he was from a county that was 95% white. And he proudly said, "We have never waved up a juvenile to the adult court," not understanding he was exactly proving my point. Because, because they don't consider there's a presumption that, what this child committed is redeemable in a sense, whereas you don't necessarily look at that. So you have to educate people on their unconscious and also conscious biases about what they have learned over time about who's entitled to what. And it's not restricted to the criminal system, it's also in the civil system as well, as what they think people are entitled to. And I will tell you that very recently, in terms of how people feel harm and so forth, very recently a study was done of first-year medical students, and more than 40% of them thought that the skin of Black people was thicker than that of white people, meaning that their threshold for pain is greater. And so when you have it, that impacts the civil justice system, because people think that if Black people, it takes them longer to feel pain, they're going to get a lower award for any injuries that they sustain. So, diversity, inclusion, and equity really permeates through all of this, through all of it, when we think about access to justice and who's entitled to access to justice and who's entitled to justice and what is fair and what is not, and that you always have to have the appropriate people in the room, because even right-thinking people really think that they're really doing the right thing, may not necessarily know if there's not another diverse person in the room who may be able to ask the questions that need to be asked. And nobody's exempt from it, not public defenders, not people who do the good work, or as I call it, God's work. Nobody's exempt from it. And so, it comes across in public defenders and who they're gonna encourage people to enter a plea of guilty without understanding all the ramifications of it. Public defenders, everybody, it's not just prosecutors, it's us do-gooders too, who are impacted by this. But there always has to be a question as to, why is this happening, and what happened to the person before that who does not look like this particular person. And so I think that has to be a part of all of our discussions and all of our thought processes, no matter what it is that we do.
Thank you.
Mhm.
I am also mindful of the time and wanted to leave some for discussion, but just maybe coming back to you, Tim, for a moment. You talked both about informal and customary justice systems as well as community-based paralegals, and we also heard in the previous panel, but also in the opening plenary, that there are places where we will not need lawyers, and I think as Betsy was saying, we all kind of tend to, in the justice sector, go back to health again and again, saying where is it that you need that tertiary care, and where is it that community level people can help us. And I know there are examples that you can give us from some of your work in Somalia, but also to perhaps think about whether some of this might be relevant for say contexts like US or developed contexts where we may not need, and you for example, Adonia, you also reflected on how when people want to access services apart from technology, you can link them up with people on the ground who can provide basic services. So I don't know if you could maybe share some thoughts on how you think this worked there in the context that you were working, but also any reflections that you might have for the US context or the other contexts.
Absolutely. I'm sorry. Yeah, thanks. So I think that was kind of a two-part question, both looking at, the role of this community-based paralegals and also the opportunities working with customary or traditional systems. And I think the community-based paralegal approach really brings benefit in response to a couple of challenges we see in the environment, like in Somalia. There's access issues, there are trust issues, there are issues of understanding, and these are simpler solved at a more ground level approach. And so, putting people into communities, giving them knowledge in the communities is a first step on the access problem. Utilizing organizations, utilizing individuals that already have familiarity in those environments, that's a good step on the trust issue. With the understanding, I think it works two ways, actually. If you have individuals from the community, they understand the political dynamics, the power dynamics that might exist, which opens their eyes to, what's good advice and what's not good advice. But it also then, they can convey information to the client to empower the client to make decisions for themselves about which justice pathway they wish to pursue, because all of them have costs and benefits. And so, for example, in the communities we worked in Somalia, the preference was to have, based on the survey data that we did, the preference was really to have a decision that was premised in Sharia, but people were most prone to go to a hair forum. And those aren't applying exactly the same thing, but a trained community paralegal could help someone understand those choices. And an individual, a client, who doesn't see good prospects from either of those could be told that they have the opportunity to go to a state court, but that there's costs, there may be social ramifications for doing so, there may be time commitments, there may be costs to doing so, and that is all information that empowers them to pursue an avenue that they decide they want to pursue. They can determine how much it's worth to them to go in which pathway. And I think, one of the important things to underscore in talking about utilizing customary and traditional forums is to recognize that, as I mentioned in my initial comments, that the hair forums are really established to serve the interests of the men that lead the communities. They are meant to preserve peace between communities, between clans, and it's a significant challenge working with women to bring disputes there. We were fortunate to work with the Somaliland Women Lawyers Association, and one of their focus was engaging with communities to convince clan elders to allow women to represent themselves. And they were able to, through a community-based paralegal, receive a complaint from a woman who wanted a divorce from a spouse who was abusive, and they were able to go to the clan elders, and she was able to express her needs in her own voice, and they were able to respond to those needs and make an adjudication that was very positive. Now that's a really great outcome. It's a little bit of an outlier within the context of Somalia, but it does show that there is a pathway there. There is opportunity to improve how those systems can operate in favor of people that are otherwise not really seen by those systems.
I don't know, are there any other reflections from the panel on this question of using people at community level to support communities in accessing justice, whether through courts or other more informal systems?
I think immigration is really interesting because there's a little bit of a tension. There's a lot of concerns about fraud and the unauthorized practice of law. Unfortunately, in immigrant communities, you oftentimes see people taking advantage. For example, you'll see scams where people are charged for forms that are available for free online, things like that. But then also there's the opportunity, I think immigration is very interesting. There's the opportunity for Department of Justice accredited representatives. So individuals who work at a Department of Justice recognized organization these individuals, if they are recognized by the Department of Justice, they are able to provide representation services before USCIS and the Executive Office for Immigration Review without being an attorney. There needs to be sufficient training and supervision, but I think in the immigration space, it's starting to move in that direction because there is the recognition that there are a lot of things that, non-attorneys can do and engage. We've also seen a lot of movements towards train the trainer programs, going out into the community, finding key leaders in the community to give Know Your Rights presentations to and empower them to go back out into their communities and share that information. So it's coming from a trusted space and a trusted individual community. When you're talking about the paralegal program, it reminded me of like community navigators, which are a big aspect of the work that we're doing now, which ties into, I think, something we're going to talk about later, is just kind of the multidisciplinary approach and how community navigators can connect people, on the legal side with other services. But I do think, this movement towards engaging people in the community, people in impacted communities, is incredibly important. We see it a lot of times with individuals who are detained. When somebody speaks to somebody, receives legal information over the phone, what happens? They call it jailhouse lawyering. It's people going back into the detention centers and sharing the information that they've had received. So I think we need to acknowledge it and empower and provide, accurate information and support it so it's responsible.
Again, it's as a result of me being a drop-in. But there are other means, and in one program that I visited, they actually were training teenagers to adjudicate cases of other teenagers, so that they were training them basically in sort of mediation skills, if you will, but also at the end of the day, they had some teenagers who were deciding the fate of another teenager who had engaged in an infraction. And it's all a part of this complete system where they have one judge who adjudicates, more serious issues, not just on a criminal level, but a civil level, and all of those things, so that juveniles won't have to go to a lot of different places. They also have a situation where they help them with their schooling, and so that they can get their GED or their high school diploma, and the judge actually awards them or presents them that. So, and they have social workers and they have healthcare providers. And so I think that when I look at something like that and the success rate of the juveniles who pass through that system, I'm always curious as to why, if it's successful here, why can't it be successful even in other parts of that city or in other locations? And I don't think that sometimes we take enough effort in looking at the cost benefit of doing things like that, and look at it downstream instead of upstream. So I think that one thing that we should be engaged in is looking at situations like that, looking at the programs in the Philippines, for example, and think about, what it takes to, again, I know I'm repeating myself, how do we replicate that? I am, I guess, a little bit of a Pollyanna. I probably think more things can be done than can be done. But I don't think that we take enough time to take a close enough look.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm just, as you were talking, I was also reminded of Sierra Leone, where they used prisoners to train as paralegals, and so prisoners who were there long term and were not really going to come out, but they helped others to think through bail, make simple bail applications where offenses, for example, were bailable. And they've really managed to bring down their pretrial detention to almost OECD levels now, which is OECD country levels, which is very good to hear. But again, maybe just to end this, just a little bit of reflection from both of you and anyone else in terms of the importance of cross-sectoral approaches. You mentioned this and you mentioned this, and I think we've been talking about how, and I think in the previous panel there was like, we need to find pathways out of justice systems, and what does that look like, and why that is important, and what kind of results can we get when we take a cross-sectoral approach. Really good to hear from you.
I just want to start by saying you're not a Pollyanna. You always find a way to say yes, right? That's what I always try to say. Find people that try to find a way to say yes. Cross-sectoral or multidisciplinary approaches, I think, are incredibly important. And then adding on to that is the peer involvement, peer navigation, peer mentorship. Lived experience is something that is finally gaining I feel like some real headway, or making some real headway on what we're trying to do with alternatives to incarceration and pre-arraignment representation, all the different kinds of things that we're trying to do. But like I said, when we go into new communities through the commission to do new homeless courts or pop-ups, trust is always the most important thing, right? Because we lawyers, judges, we think we're really important, and we only trust ourselves, right? We only trust other lawyers or people involved in it, right? I think the suggestion earlier that is kind of an interesting about, there's doctors, there's physician assistants, there's different levels, and we have lawyer, paralegal, right? Like there might be some interesting levels that we can, look at ways to do that. But in terms of the trust, by selecting, one provider that the court trusts, right? Then that provider can be a peer navigator to the other providers, right? That will bring that trust in. That's how we got to, I said I think we're actually 97 now, right? 97 approved providers that can trust each other, right? And based on that, if I have a client in there that is dealing with substance abuse, but they also have mental health, the provider doesn't just say, well, you know what, not my job, right? Because we have that network, they can call the mental health provider, right? And create that multidisciplinary approach. So it's not just, when you're a hammer, you see nails as an attorney or a judge, right? Like you want to tell them, yes, you're going to go to this program, right? But the way that the ABA or the San Diego model works for homeless courts is that it's provider-centric, right? The providers know when the client has dealt with their issue, right? And only once they've done that, that's when the provider presents the client to us. And then we say, you know what, we trust you because you've been bringing clients to us for this period of time and you've been vetted by fellow peer providers. And because of that, now we're willing to grant that relief. And I think it really benefits the client as a whole person and not just the criminal defendant.
New microphone. Multidisciplinary approaches are becoming increasingly important in immigration practice. We're seeing it in our offsite projects in Houston and Harlingen and San Diego. We're starting to incorporate social workers into our practice, clinical social workers that may be able to actually do clinical work and provide evaluation and support. Because I think what we found is immigration, and with many of these issues that we're discussing, it's not a solitary issue. Not having immigration status impacts your ability. You're not eligible for a lot of housing. You're not eligible for a lot of benefits. You may have, you've probably suffered some sort of trauma by virtue of your journey here to the United States. You may have fears and apprehensions about law enforcement and seeking protection if you're a victim of gender-based violence. So there's so many different intricacies, and I think the number one thing we hear as immigration lawyers is, I want work authorization. And then, kind of going back to, attorneys thinking that we know everything and what's best for everybody, we're thinking long-term. Well, your work authorization's, an immediate benefit, but you need to think about how you're going to stay here permanently. How are you getting on a pathway to permanency? But people's immediate desperate need is to either get out of detention or get employment authorization. And by getting that employment authorization, they're able to access a lot of other benefits. So, thinking about immigration services that involve case management, involve social work, involve medical legal partnerships, which are becoming, we're seeing a lot more of that. And then also engaging community members, whether it's religious organizations, other, and going back to community navigators, this is where people from the community that know, where people might be able to access services or, are trusted to help people make those reports and things like that. So I was really excited when you had this question down, because I feel like it's something that, at least in immigration, we've been talking a lot more. And I think, when I hear about your court, the homeless court, I'm like, it made me really excited, this one-stop shop, to be able to address a lot of the needs, because it's not individual. And we need to be looking at people more holistically and trying to help them and provide something that is, once again, people-centered, which is not one issue.
Absolutely. Problems never come in neat packages of this is legal and medical or relating to homelessness. Now, this has been so interesting. I don't know if there are questions from the floor for the panelists. Nope. It's post-lunch. Okay, it seems the round. So maybe I can probably reflect on a couple of things and maybe a few last reflections from you. I think we had a very good discussion looking at some of the most important things that relate to people-centered justice. We talked about data and importance of data, but one of the things that we did not perhaps touch upon as much was the fact that we use data to design programs, to do a lot of things, but how do we use data for more prevention? And as lawyers, as judges, and I happen to be a lawyer too by profession, we are very reactive in our approach. You have a problem, come to us, we will solve it. And we need to be perhaps moving towards also an approach which is more preventive in its thinking. And again, going back to doctors and health, if it's the difference between someone coming to you and coming with a medical problem and you treating it one by one, or you taking a public health kind of approach. And we don't take that approach, and we need to be thinking more and more about how do we do that. As we were writing this report, Justice for All, this mentions a fable, an old fable, which basically says, people keep falling off a cliff, and what we do is station an ambulance at the bottom, but don't think about putting a fence around the cliff.
Right.
And that's what justice programs are, that ambulance which will treat you case by case by case, but will not think about what is happening on a systemic level and how do we deal with that. As I started as a very young lawyer providing legal aid for women, and I would see case after case coming to me, and women saying, okay, we want a divorce, there's domestic violence, you go to these different courts that were discussed earlier, you get some kind of judgment after many years and say, okay, you'll now get maintenance. And then the next thing happens is after 5 months, she's back and she says, can I get execution of that order because the man is not paying up. And if we were to look at, and even at that time, I was like, I'm doing this again and again in every case. Can we just collect data about what kinds of problems are coming before courts? And not just courts, this is also about ombudsmen. Same kinds of problems for service delivery going to ombudsmen. Can we just look at that data and say, okay, something needs to change in policy because everyone is coming back with the same problem, and that's what we probably need to start thinking about.
But do you think that they know that this data exists because they're seeing this boomerang, these people coming back and forth? It's more the willingness of them and how they're going to allocate resources, whether they think it's worthy to allocate resources to sort of fix it, or whether they want to use a Band-Aid approach because they think it costs less and we'll deal with it at the time and put some money to it instead of putting a big pot of money in it to try to resolve the issue. So I don't necessarily know that it's a function of them not understanding and not having the data before them. I think it's more the willingness of getting in front of it, understanding the data that you have, and that in the long run, that it's going to be more beneficial.
I'm not very sure of that. That could be a reason, Paulette, but I also think it's individual judges, right, who are getting these cases. And judiciaries in different contexts collect different kinds of data. So judges collect different data, police collects different data, prison authorities collect different data, ombudsmen collect different data. Often they don't talk to each other, one.
That's true.
Second is the kind of data that judiciary often collects in many contexts is how many cases come, what is the time taken to resolve, pre-trial detention, but what are the cases coming again and again? I don't know on civil cases if that analysis is done by judiciaries. So it's about analyzing the kinds of cases, how many of them are coming, how much, going beyond how much time we take, because it's all from the sense of performance evaluation of judges more than the problems of the people. So that's, I think, something that can be done much more effectively by judiciaries, by the entire justice sector. And I think Sam will speak to it in terms of whose business it is to think about justice for people. Because if you look at justice ministries, they often, and look at their budgets, their often budgets perhaps will flow to the judiciary through the Ministry of Justice, but it's that level of thinking about budgeting through judiciary. Then it might be prosecutors, then it might be about public defenders.
Right.
Who is thinking about budgeting for people? Can people access justice? Where does that budget lie in any country? And unlike other departments where they will think, health will think, where is my budget for preventing
Right.
infections, for ensuring public health? So we need to be thinking about how money flows and how we think about the justice sector. But
I think we were saying the same thing.
there is a question.
Yes, thank you so much for speaking with us today. My question is a little bit broad about social media, whether you see the evolving digital landscape and the use of social media, especially the spread of misinformation on social media. If you view it as more of an opportunity to be able to kind of get information out there to all different communities, or if you view it as more of a detriment that's kind of impacting your work and people-centered justice and access to justice as a whole.
I actually wanted to talk about this earlier and forgot, so perfect, beautiful. I think there is opportunity. Something that we've been moving towards is, making little short videos that are shared on WhatsApp to try to combat some of the misinformation out there, using trusted people in the community to be the messengers of this information. We saw this recently with the Afghan newcomers. There's a lot of misinformation about a one-year filing deadline. People are panicking, running out and just filing applications without any assistance or receiving any sort of orientation or information. So there's been concerted efforts on joining targeted Facebook groups, sharing information that's on video, visual, a lot of different ways. Because the information, you're absolutely right, there's so much misinformation out there, but there has to be, I think we need to be savvy in trying to get the right information also in these conversations, and using WhatsApp has just been an incredible tool. We've used it a lot in Haitian communities because we saw that in South Florida, a lot of misinformation. We'd create little videos, get it out, and within like 15, 20 minutes, it's reached like thousands and thousands of people. So I think we need to be using these tools, and we need to be thinking creatively around it. Thank you for asking that question. It was on my list.
I have a somewhat related question in two ways to the exchange that's just happened. And one is the absence of trust, the damage to trust that social media can also create, and how misinformation is magnified. Of course, it's an opportunity that we all need to exploit. But at the same time, I think we need to all be thinking about defensive measures to combat the divisiveness and this luncheon speakers thinking about the sliding away or the rewriting of the past, and how in Russia, Ukraine, how to combat that impact so that we don't lose the next generation too when the hostility is over. So that's kind of a raving statement rather than a specific question, but maybe thinking about specifically combating the destructive aspects of social media, specifically with regard to the erosion of trust. How can you be human-centered justice when groups are pitted against each other in an increasingly intense way? And then to the second point about impacting the system as opposed to having projects, Andrew's not here. We always look to him when we're making a USAID or donor-oriented question as if he were the great God. Funding, we're all driven by budgets. And so there's perverse incentives, obviously, to having a successful project. And that is counter to the holistic approaches and the multi-sectoral approaches that we're also trying to work towards, because it requires a kind of collaborative or broad-based funding that is different than organizations and individual pots of funding. So I think all of you have had to deal with that in your individual ways and have clearly been very successful at cutting across some of those seemingly difficult challenges. So I'd be very interested in anything that you want to say in response to those two observations that follow up on the questions that have already been asked.
Well, no great wise words of wisdom, but I completely agree in terms of these divisive narratives, which we are now seeing across the world. And it's not just random people. Sometimes it's people who are in power, in authority, in government, or just outside of the government, who are trying to use this. And I think as lawyers, as people in the justice sector, we need to think about how do we counter the divisive narratives, and especially in immigration space, I think that becomes very, very important. And we've been recently trying to grapple with and think, so we have this at Pathfinders, a work stream which brings together humanitarians and justice actors together to think through, when you're talking immigration, how do you counter divisive narratives of these people who have come here and will take away our jobs and are very opposed to our culture? How do you bring host communities and people together? And justice can be a way, because often data shows that problems of people are the same. It's how you deal with those problems, and not to alienate people, but bring host communities together with people, with migrant populations, and have similar kinds of conversations. But you're absolutely right. We need to be much more innovative in thinking about how we counter divisive narratives and where they kind of emerge from, and the root causes of that.
Right, and those divisive narratives, diversity comes into play in that regard too, because, you know, the way people think about immigrants and where they are coming from makes a major difference in how they are treated once they get here.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I would only say, in terms of social media, one of the things I often have to remind myself is that depending on which platform we're talking about, right? Like, you can say whatever you want, but it's a question of who's listening, right? And a lot of times the people that are listening are the ones that that already agree with what you're saying, right? So I think we have to remember that. And then along those same lines, you know, we talk about data-driven, and like I said, data nerd, or just nerd in general, let's be honest. But data is incredibly important, but what data does is data allows us to tell a story, right? I can have all the numbers in the world, but listening to the judge talk about the gentleman that's in his courtroom, that means more than the data than me saying about 15,000 cases, right? So thinking about that and thinking about who you're talking to and who's listening, that's what's going to really make the difference whether you get that budget, right? One of the things that Malia was saying earlier in response, like, well, I don't really want us or want the public defense to have to do that, or want the judge to have to be the one to find the job, or whatever it may be. I have two comments to that. First of all, sometimes you just have to, whoever's willing to do it, right? Wherever that money is, if the public defender's office, for whatever reason, we had some money to do a grant for pre-arraignment representation, and we're trying to connect them with jobs and do all those things. Yeah, I don't think that we should be in the business of doing it, but you know what? We're going to do it, right? Because we're the ones that were able to get the funding for it, right? So if you end up funding just one side and not the other, right? If you end up funding the beginning, the preventative side, right, at the expense of funding the legal or public defender or court system, right? Then you end up losing a whole group of people that you're not funding to help, that are in that emergency room of law, that I would say that the criminal, justice system is, right? But if you only fund the Band-Aids, then you're going to keep getting a whole bunch of situations where you need more Band-Aids. So you kind of have to do a surge of funding all of it to try and solve the problem. So yeah, all the money in the world would be great. Thanks.
Tomorrow.
Hi, my name is Karen. I work with the Department of State, and my question is about a sense of entitlement and how that affects relationships of trust with the community. So we in the State Department, we assist a lot of American citizens who are incarcerated overseas, and I would say most of them are pretty grateful, but some are not, and they're very angry that you didn't bust them out with a Black Hawk helicopter and get them Fifth Amendment and First Amendment rights that they do not have in country, right? And then you get really negative press reviews, right, from the family, et cetera, and that really erodes trust, right? So my question for you in this context in which you work, which I applaud you, but with the rise of like social media, there's also rising entitlement, I would say, in the world. And so a lot of what your work sounds like is taking people to go fish, but you still have to go fish. So what happens when fishing is too hard? Like, Matt, you're like, you take a step, then I'll take a step. But what if I don't want to take the step and that's too hard? And so Matt came to my neighborhood and he didn't do what I wanted him to do for me, and that can erode trust rather quickly on social media, et cetera. So how do you deal with that, the sense of entitlement with the good work that you do?
I would say that we're never, that's a bold statement, it's going to be very hard to get rid of all bad behavior, right? There's always going to be a certain element of society that there's bad behavior. One of the things we always talk about is carrot and stick, right? And when I give these presentations to new jurisdictions, I talk about how the homeless court program kind of brings more carrot back into a system that has a lot of big sticks, right? We're not going to be able to get rid of sticks. There's always going to have to be a certain amount of sticks in the community. But I think that when we're looking at an individual, entitlement, right? Entitlement is a subjective point of view, right? We think they're entitled. They think that's what they deserve. If you make the carrot enticing enough, then you won't need the stick. The carrot should be the absence of stick, right? Sometimes you do have to have those things that we might think are entitled, right? But if we want to encourage behavior that we as a society want, we've seen how using all sticks or very, very big sticks has worked or not worked, right? We try to bring a lot more of that carrot there. We had this conversation in our collaborative court advisory group in San Diego a couple of months ago, right? They were talking about how can we encourage, participation in these courts. And I'm like, look, sometimes you might have to do a little more of the gift cards, right? Sometimes they're like, we're gonna pay them to participate, and after they did something wrong, it's like, do you wanna modify behavior, right? So sometimes, even if it feels uncomfortable to us, right, to have to provide those bigger sticks, even if we think it's a sense of entitlement, if we want to incorporate that behavior change, I think we have to do it.
It's motivation.
Yes.
You had a question?
Yeah, this question is from my coworker online who is using me as a method of communication, but going off of that, do you find that these holistic services, such as what you've been talking about, or health assistance, affects how the communities trust the justice system and the impact of low trust or increasing trust?
I personally think that it would help in the trust area if someone goes for what they believe is, for example, a criminal justice matter. And while they're there, a social worker asks them, what is your living arrangement? Or an educator is asking, are you getting the sort of tools that you need to be properly educated? And so I think that when a person sees a group of people who are not saying, let's render this verdict for this bad behavior that you've engaged in, let's look at maybe some of the underlying causes that brought you here today. And I think that will really help the trust factor. And when you have the trust factor, then people are inclined to believe sort of that the system is working, and they may not, if they believe that they're really going to get some assistance in a lot of different areas that actually cause them to be where they are now, then they may not engage in that type of sort of criminal behavior, using that as an example, again, because they believe that somebody really cares about them as a person who's willing to look at these other aspects of their lives to see how all the pieces sort of fit together that brought them here. So I think that really helps in the trust area when you bring a number of different disciplines into one area to assist a person.
And recently, we've seen efforts with USCIS, the Department of Homeland Security, getting back into the community, going to events to talk about the citizenship process. There's so many countless individuals that are green card holders that are eligible to apply for citizenship and haven't yet done so. And we've seen a return to that. I think that the issue is we see it kind of during different administrations that the commitment to creating trust and engaging in the community can shift. So we're just kind of getting back to the place where we have community relations officers with USCIS, getting back out there and creating that trust. And it's also creating trust with the providers because, there's hesitance in community to have them come in the door because they are the part of the Department of Homeland Security. So it's the agencies creating trust with the providers to then be able to engage in community activities where they can create trust directly with the community.
And I'll just answer your, absolutely it does, right? Not just holistic defense and it just, I'm speaking from the, criminal side of it, right? I mean, we just started this pretrial unit, right? To try and bridge that gap between that first court date arraignment or just before arraignment and their first actual readiness status date. And what we're doing is we're sitting down with them and saying, what's your problem, right? Not what's your problem about, but like, what do you need, right? And it was one of the first couple of days we started doing this, and I sat down with the gentleman. I was like, okay, so you're going to be released today, and your court date is going to be in 11 days. What's your situation? Do you have a phone? Do you have a place to go? Where's your next meal going to be? How can I connect you with the attorney that's going to be assigned? And he just looked at me. This is a guy that has been doing it on the installment plan, right? And he's like, nobody's ever asked me that before. And we've talked to the attorneys since then, right, that have received these clients that we've been trying to help and try to provide that wraparound service before they get there. And it's like, yeah, they actually came and they were ready to talk to the attorney about their case, right? They weren't saying, oh, you're just the public pretender that wants me to plead, right? It's like, okay, well, you actually did want to help me, right? So I'm going to listen to you about your advice on the case. So it absolutely does make it so that we're treating them like a human. They feel like they can receive information like the full human that they are.
Can I also comment on another aspect on this, and which I think for many governments is an important aspect, that of money. That how much money can we invest, like to get social service, support from a psychologist, maybe some kind of support for providing a temporary shelter. And I think it's important for us to remember and maybe invest more money and time into looking at the cost benefits of investing in justice. And if you were to look at this report, which I keep on selling, it did make this case of, why you must invest in justice. OECD has done research. It shows that, countries lose up to 0.5 to 3% of their GDPs owing to legal problems. Canada's invested in doing research regularly, which shows that, people lose up to a month's wages trying to, so you might lose jobs, your health might be impacted, and then government will end up paying either housing benefits, unemployment benefits, right, or some kind of medical aid, which I don't know how much in US, but definitely in Canada. So governments need to think about where they want to pay and how they want to pay and why they must invest in justice, and how providing this holistic support might seem expensive now, but might end up saving you money in the end. And we do need more research on that. I don't know if there are any other questions, last reflections. I give you 5 minutes of your life back.
Thank you, Swati. Thank you, Pamela. Let's give a round of applause. Really appreciate it. All right, we'll take a short break and then we'll close out the session. Thank you.